So I would like to welcome everybody and thank you so much for joining us tonight on our North Country Live Fall Series, Indigenous Voices. I would like to thank our sponsors this evening, North Franklin Federal Credit Union and our very own North Country Community College Foundation. Before we begin, we have a lot of people on this call tonight, and I'd like to ask us if we could all just mute our phones so that we don't have any interruption and we keep our quality of our recording just as good as it can be. And this doesn't mean, though, that we wouldn't like your questions. So if you do have questions during the presentation, I encourage you to type them into the chat, and our moderator will answer the questions at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this program over to our moderator, Mr. Bruce Kelly.
Thanks, Selena. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Kelly, and I work in the Office of Student Life at North Country Community College. Before I reintroduce our guest speaker tonight, I just want to give a little preview of our next NC Live program, which is going to happen on Thursday, October 29th at 7 o'clock. I'll be moderating a panel of speakers on the topic of how the COVID-19 pandemic affected Akwesasne. I was lucky enough to get 4 folks to join me. They include Benjamin Hearn, who is a sub-chief and member of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Council, Jalessa Barrero, who's the executive director of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, James Lazor, who's the director of economic development for the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe, and lastly but not least, Michael Cook, who's the director of the St. Regis Mohawk Health Services. It should be a very informative discussion, so we hope you'll join us for that. But more importantly, tonight I'm very pleased to reintroduce our guest presenter, Darren Bonaparte, who will be presenting the second part of his North Country Live program that he began back on October 1st. Darren grew up in Akwesasne, is currently the director of the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe's Historic Preservation Office. He has studied the history of Akwesasne for more than 30 years. Darren is the author of several books and articles and is a frequent presenter at schools and colleges and universities. His website, the Wampum Chronicles, has been online for 21 years. Following Darren's presentation tonight, we'll have time for a short question and answer period. So as Selena said, please add your questions to the chat feature and we'll revisit them at the end of the program. Darren, Sego, and welcome back. It's all yours.
Sego. Well, I'm glad to be able to do part 2 of this presentation. I want to thank my wife for reminding me earlier tonight, saying, don't you have a gig or something tonight? And I'm like, yes. Anyway, we pulled it off. Anyway, so here I am, giving you part 2 of my presentation of Akwesasne history. And the focus of tonight's presentation is the 19th century. And a lot of incredible things happened in the 19th century. It's a time of great transition for our people. Now, if you recall, I want to just kind of backtrack a little bit about the earlier time period, the 17th, or actually it was the 1700s, the 18th century, where our people, the Mohawks and the people of Akwesasne and Ganawage, were combatants alongside European colonies in the various wars, the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, and we were fighting in our own style, using war clubs and tomahawks, muskets, and also painting up in war paint and doing a lot of ambushing. So it was a separate kind of fighting than what the colonists did, lining up with muskets and getting shot in the field. Our people were more known to ambush, to scout, to be more mobile. And so in the 19th century, in the 1800s, that came to an end after the War of 1812. So that's what I want to start talking about tonight, is the War of 1812. It was, in my mind, the last of the great colonial wars that our people got involved in. And because the next major conflict was the American Civil War in the middle of the century, that had a different scenario for us. In that war, when our people went to fight they had to be regular soldiers. They couldn't, you know, keep in their own separate war parties or anything like that. It was a completely different change, and a lot of other changes occurred in that century. So I want to talk all about that tonight, and been doing a lot of research on this particular century for my latest book. And if you don't mind me interrupting with a little bit of commercial for my latest book. It's called An Early History of Akwesasne, the works of Franklin B. Huff, 1822 to 1885. And that's a map of Akwesasne. And this book is all about his adventures here when he came to do research for his book in the 1850s. So it is this Franklin B. Huff, a medical doctor who was also a history buff, who captured the first full history of Akwesasne that was ever written. And historians have always drawn from it. So I recently wrote this book to reintroduce his text that he wrote about Akwesasne, and to also include other materials that he found during his research that he didn't get to publish, and other things that he wrote and published later in his career. So it ended up being quite a little project, and I did it during COVID, the lockdown. So if you want to know more of what I'm talking about tonight, that's the thing. Come to Akwesasne, come to one of the stores, and pick up a copy of it. And I'll let you figure out which stores. But to get back to my presentation about the 19th century and Akwesasne, the War of 1812 was one of those conflicts that people still argue about today. Both sides claim to have won it. But for our people, we know we've lost that war. It's ridiculous. And it was one of those conflicts where we were divided on both. We were, members of our community were on both sides. And that was because primarily of the fact that after the American Revolution, Great Britain and the United States drew a border right through Akwesasne territory. And we don't know today whether they considered the existence of our community when they drew that line, but it's a kind of an awkward line if you ever look at the maps, where it the border just kind of goes in a kind of a crazy little fashion through the middle of the river, and then all of a sudden it goes backward to the 45th parallel and then goes straight east to all the way to Maine. So that's the border at Akwesasne. And when it was decided upon, nobody bothered to consult us. It was just a done deal. So later on, when surveyors showed up and told us about it, they said, don't worry, this will not bother you. This is to keep British and Americans from fighting. It's consider it to be 8 feet high, and there'll never be an Indian 8 feet high, 8 feet tall, so you don't have to worry about it. It'll never bother you. That was the promise, and we talk about that in oral tradition. So the border coming through our territory wasn't supposed to apply to us, but as time went by, we found out, yes, very much it does. And it even resulted in a little bit of a schism between the chiefs, where there was a breakaway council that took up on the American side of the reserve. And that's the origin of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. It was a breakaway from the main body and setting up shop as the American side. Anyway, so that's the scenario when the War of 1812 broke out, is you have this very loosely marked out border, and our people are just pretty much going about their business, hunting, fishing, trapping, trading, doing whatever they got to do, going back and forth as if it didn't exist, because it doesn't exist. It's not tangible. It's just something that people believe in, that there's a border. And this was probably before they put in the official markers to say where it was. So all of that is kind of a little bit sketchy at this time. Well, when did all of this stuff crystallize? So the fact is that when the border came in and the people kind of just accepted it and said, whatever, if it doesn't apply to us, we're fine. But the War of 1812 brought it home and made it very clear that that border matters. Now, what happened in the War of 1812 was the British decided, and the Americans agreed, that the Indians, the Native Americans, should stay out of it. And pardon me if you're offended by the use of the word Indian. It's just, we say it all the time. It's not, you know, really acceptable, like when you publish and write and stuff like that, but it just falls out. Anyway, so to get back to my story, I go off on tangents once in a while. I'm getting older. Anyway, so the War of 1812, they decided we don't want any of the people of Akwesasne or any of the other Haudenosaunee communities participating, because during the American Revolution, we were famous for burning villages down and houses down and hooting and hollering and making it a very uncomfortable conflict. So they didn't want any of that in this new conflict, so they warned us. And we even have a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the chiefs of Akwesasne saying, keep your people out of the war, stay out of it. It's not meant for you. And, you know, if any of you pick up weapons against the United States, well, we'll put you down. So there is that actual letter. You can even look it up online. Anyway, so we're sitting at home thinking, well, good, we get to sit this one out. We don't have to die for these crazy people fighting. Well, the British decided they're going to station voyageurs in the village of St. Regis because it's on the border and because of all the rivers that go in and out of Akwesasne. They wanted to keep an eye on the place to make sure that the Americans didn't cause any trouble. So they're violating the neutrality that both sides had agreed upon. Well, so they stationed some voyageurs, and those are French-Canadian fur traders who are pretty tough customers, so nobody messes with them. And we knew them already because many of our people were in the fur trade, working for the same companies. So we did not consider it to be a complete invasion by the British. Plus, we considered ourselves British allies, and that's a very important fact that will play out in this. So we allowed the voyageurs to set up camp at the point where St. Regis Church is. And if you go to Akwesasne and visit the church, it's the little part of Quebec that you have to drive through New York to get to. It's on a peninsula where the St. Regis meets the St. Lawrence. And so there's the church sitting at the point. That's where the British assigned the voyageurs to set up a little camp. And the Americans heard about this, probably because the pro-American faction in Akwesasne let them know about it. And they sent troops from Plattsburgh that came to Fort Covington, which was then called French Mills. And then they staged an attack on the voyageurs that were stationed in Akwesasne. And it happened on October 22nd. They came in the middle of the night, early in the morning, I think on the 23rd. I get the dates mixed up. About 5 o'clock in the morning, they broke up into 3 parties, and they converged on the camp from 3 different directions. And I think about 6 guys were killed of the voyageurs. The rest surrendered. The American troops that came in ransacked the village after the voyageurs were captured, and just basically caused a big commotion, took whatever they could find of value, and ran out of there. So about a month later, there was a counterattack, and the British attacked Fort Covington and captured back some of their men, or something like to that effect. So those kind of things were happening in Akwesasne right at the beginning of the war. And so the commotion that the American attack caused angered so many people that they decided they were not going to just sit out this war. About maybe as many as 70 joined up with the British, including a bunch of chiefs. And so they broke the neutrality by doing so. And about 20 supported the Americans. And this faction that supported the Americans were under the guidance of Colonel Lewis Cook, who I mentioned last time I spoke, as being an officer in the Continental Army during the American Revolution. He was a lieutenant colonel, a commissioned officer, and he was also one of our chiefs. And he had a parentage consisting of an African father and an Abenaki Indian mother. So he was accepted as one of us. That's what adoption was all about, is once you're adopted in it, you're one of us. You get a Mohawk name and that's it, period. So he was by this time in his 70s. He was a very old man, and yet he rallied to the American cause for the War of 1812. He felt we had to stand behind the Americans because they were just going to win. There's just no way around it. So he had that real conviction about it. And they even gave him an honorary general commission and even a uniform. A wealthy man in Ogdensburg purchased, had a tailor-made brigadier general uniform made for Lewis Cook, and he was known as General Lewis from then on. So because he broke the neutrality, he couldn't go home. So he spent a lot of time in Plattsburgh and also at Sackett's Harbor, and eventually went out to the Buffalo area and lost his life in the war. And this was in October of 1814, and had participated in the Battle of Lundy's Lane. And so he's in his late 70s, and you don't mess with old Akwesasne guys when they're in their 70s, I guess. So he had quite a following, mostly family, but also some of his supporters, political supporters that had set up shop as the American so-called American St. Regis Indians. But anyway, so you had a smaller faction fighting for the Americans, a larger group of about 70 supporting the British. And then you also had the neutral people that didn't want anything to do with any side of it, who were the majority in the community. So the families of those who supported the British were basically kicked out of the village. They had to go and live on the islands in meager little shacks. Some of them went all the way to Cornwall and lived there for a while. So they just couldn't return to their village. Their houses were taken over by the neutral faction. And it took them about 20 or 30 years, long after the war came to an end, to be able to return and to resume their habitations. So very divisive conflict for Akwesasne. Now, as I mentioned, Colonel Lewis Cook was very old. He succumbed to injuries in October of 1814 and passed away. And his position as a leader was eventually taken on by some of his followers and supporters. And they continued to perform as leaders under the St. Regis American faction, or whatever it was called at the time. So you also still had a faction of chiefs on the Canadian side of the border who were still, governing, still doing their thing, still chosen by clan mothers and doing their business. There was no elections by this time. So the War of 1812, there were a lot of conflicts that took place out in the Niagara frontier, where Colonel Lewis had been engaged, but many of our people were on the other side, coming from north of Lake Ontario to fight on the side of the British at these same battles, Lundy's Lane and Beaver Dam and all those places that happened, all those big battles that happened. So our own people are on different sides of a war. I know that's kind of common for our history to have different people choosing to fight against their own people. It just seems to be that way. And a lot of people, deride that, and they say, we never should have taken sides in any of those conflicts. We should have always maintained, the unity of the community. But there's something to be said for having little pockets of, pro-American, pro-French, pro-British, whatever, because you never know. Maybe that little faction, should the war go their way, maybe they can speak on behalf of the others that had a different perspective, either neutral or chose the other side. So maybe that pro-American, say, can help these people, negotiate safety in the new regime. So it's kind of like a defense policy to have a little factionalism in your community. That's my understanding of it. Others may see it differently, but it seems like that's just accepted and how it was. Although they, of course, preferred to, maintain unity, but sometimes in war you just can't. So the War of 1812, when it came to an end, the divisions and the hatred and anger caused by that war festered for a long time. And the pro-American faction, whenever there was a big ceremony in St. Regis Village at the church, a mass or something, sometimes they would have a big procession, kind of like a little parade that would go through the village. Well, the American faction would show up with their stars and stripes and raising quite a ruckus. And I know it seems hard to imagine, but something about that just brings that out of people. So they would come and raise a big commotion, and the other people who found themselves being harassed in that manner would write complaints to Ottawa or the British government saying, can you do something about these guys? But it never came to blows. They always kind of, got to the point where they would just kind of do it for show. So that pro-American and pro-British and pro-neutral resentment just continued to boil for a long time. Now, something happened in the decades after. There was a couple other external conflicts, like the Patriot Rebellion in the 1830s, which was basically French nationalists in Quebec were trying to raise up a big commotion and kick out the British or something like that. Our people, to a small degree, got involved in that conflict also. There was a gentleman named Papineau in the village who seemed to be one of the leaders of that kind of adhered to this rebellion, and also Tarbell. So that wasn't that big a deal. It blew over eventually. And but what really was of note in the 1830s was in 1832 there was epidemic breakouts that took out a lot of people. And I have to mention the statistics in my book because I'm basically reprinting a manuscript that talks about this the death toll. So I'm not going to give you the statistics, but it was over 100 people were lost in one of these epidemics, and it was cholera, tuberculosis, and a few other smallpox. Those were known to just come in and just decimate huge amounts of people. And they said an entire family died except one person, and there was said to be a mass grave that was dug for all the people that passed away in this one horrible summer of sickness. So that gives you pause for thought, especially now with the global pandemic that's killed over 200 and probably 15,000 by now. It's staggering to even comprehend today what's going on in the world. But to think about Akwesasne, which was probably really only maybe 300 or 400 people at the most at the time, to lose so many, it must have just been a catastrophic event to go through that. And so when I have to research things like that, it really weighs kind of heavy on you, to be considering these are your ancestors. And had this epidemic disease not taken out so many people, our population could be 30% larger today. You just don't know. So another thing that happened during this century was our chiefs, during this epidemic, our chiefs also died. It is said that about 5 of our chiefs died, and they had to have a ceremony to replace them once things had gotten okay to do that. And so a bunch of canoe delegations came from Ganawage and Ganasatake, that came to Akwesasne to do the ceremony. And it was just like in the old Haudenosaunee Confederacy, where when one nation loses a chief, the other nations come together to do the ceremony to raise up a new chief. Well, in our case at Akwesasne, it was the Ganawage chiefs and the Ganasatake chiefs that came in to put the ceremony through, as if we were like separate nations. So they came in, and there's a big description of it in a newspaper article from the time that talks about this ceremony, and it was very close to what is described in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for their ceremonies of replacing a chief, raising up his replacement, and all the little activities that occur leading up to the ceremony. So that occurred to replace those chiefs that had died during the epidemic. So pretty heavy things going on in that time. So they recover. There were a few other epidemics that happened later on, right up until 1849, when Franklin Huff came in 1852. He noted that the people seemed indolent and lazy to him. Well, they had just gotten through a smallpox breakout that 500 people had acquired. So you know what a horror smallpox was. So you can kind of forgive the people for not appearing so energetic when he met them, but they had just gotten over a smallpox outbreak. So give them a break, you know. So to bring it up to the middle of the 19th century and the visit of Franklin Huff, and let me just show you a picture of him that my daughter drew in pen and ink, based on an old painting of Franklin Huff. And he was just a young man. He was a medical doctor, but just a crazy history buff, a geology buff. And he came to Akwesasne to learn its history. He was writing history of St. Lawrence and Franklin counties. And I have a copy of it here. This is the book he wrote. And a chapter of this book was dedicated to Akwesasne, chapter 2, in fact. And you see it's all tabbed out because this is my working copy of the book. Everybody who studies Akwesasne history has a copy of that book, and it's got purple, green, and yellow tabs all over it, just like mine. So it's the Bible of Akwesasne history, or at least the Old Testament. So it's worthy of reprinting what he found in a new book, just to make it more accessible, because that one's pretty heavy. It would be a shame if that fell on a little kid. Anyway, so this is a little bit lighter, a little bit softer. So Franklin Huff comes to Akwesasne in 1852 and meets the chiefs, meets the missionary, meets two missionaries. He also meets Reverend Eliezer Williams. Reverend Eliezer Williams may be known to some of the people listening tonight as the so-called Lost Dauphin of France. And his legend has kind of dominated Akwesasne history for a long time. And the story goes that some people believe, mainly him, that he was not actually a child from Ganawage, but was actually the Lost Dauphin of France, the son of Marie Antoinette and the King Louis of France, King Louis, I should say, who were executed in the French Revolution. You know, you might have seen the movie. So the legend is that the children were imprisoned and died, and their son, who was the heir to the throne, supposedly was spirited out of the Tower of London, or not the Tower of London, sorry, this is taking place in France. Anyway, so this so-called Lost Dauphin is, legend has it, spirited to America, where he's raised by Indians. And this crazy story had no basis in truth. The real child died a poor and pitiful death in the real prison and never escaped. So, but Eliezer Williams, who really was from Ganawage, somehow was told about this legend and decided to promote himself as the actual Lost Dauphin, because he just, as somebody of mixed heritage living in an Indian reserve, and he is one of his ancestors was a captive from Deerfield, Massachusetts. And Eunice Williams was her name. So he has non-native blood. So because he had a few of the features of that heritage, there were those who doubted that he was a true native person. So he married that to this crazy legend about the Lost Dauphin. And towards the end of his career, because he was a missionary throughout most of his life, and towards the end of his life, when he was had pretty much run out the missionary card, he decided to promote himself as this mysterious Lost Dauphin of France. And he got to be quite famous for it. He was able to do the lecture circuit in the United States. And although he died in poverty, he still managed to get a few half-decent gigs. And you got to tip your hat to those Ganawages, man. They can really pull off a doozy. Anyway, so Eliezer Williams just so happened to be the son of American Revolution veteran Thomas Williams, who had actually fought in the American Revolution on the side of the British. And he also was friends with none other than Colonel Lewis Cook, later General Lewis Cook, who had fought on the American side. So he knew them. And he had also himself, Eliezer Williams now, when he was a young man in his early 20s, had also served as a scout and a message carrier for the Americans himself during the War of 1812. He later claimed that he was an officer and all kinds of stuff. But just like his claim to being the Lost Dauphin of France, it was pretty much a big con job. So Eliezer Williams, though, knew these very important figures, and he could read and write. So when Franklin Huff met Eliezer Williams, and Eliezer Williams did not impress Franklin Huff one bit as far as his claim went, he didn't buy it for a second. In fact, many of the people he had met already told him to watch out for this guy. He's not to be trusted. And so he didn't buy into this outlandish claim. But he knew, because Eliezer Williams had such a connection to these veteran chiefs who were already deceased by that time, that he wanted to know more about them. So Eliezer Williams agreed to write what he knew, and he wrote these biographies of not only Thomas Williams, his father, but Colonel Lewis Cook, and also William Gray, who was another one of those American Revolution veterans who had married into the community and was one of our clerk, and some even say a chief, but it's doubtful. Anyway, so he writes these biographies. Franklin Huff takes them, rewrites them for his book, and keeps the documents in his papers. They're sitting in Albany in the New York State Library today in the Franklin Huff collection. So those are the manuscripts are also in the book. I thought it would be important for history's sake to have those written in his own words, all the mistakes and everything in there too. So just so that those documents exist. In my opinion, they are the most important documents of Native American involvement in the American Revolution and the War of 1812 around. They're just unsurpassed because they're written by somebody who knew them, even though he had a credibility problem. They're very important documents. So it was my honor to put them together in a new book. It wasn't any fun transcribing them, let me tell you. So let me just take a drink of some oneganos. Wow, I'm just rambling on. My wife probably thinks I'm crazy. She's upstairs, probably shaking her head. Anyway, sitting in my kitchen all by myself talking history. You probably think I do it without a Zoom meeting too, right? You're probably right. Anyway, to get back to our wonderful story of Franklin Huff coming to Akwesasne and meeting Eliezer Williams, gets what he needs, doesn't buy into his story, and then publishes his material. And he comes back later on because Franklin Huff gets a job with the New York State Census, and he comes back in 1855, 1865, and 1875. And then after his time with the census, he writes another account comparing his first time in Akwesasne to his last time and all the changes that had occurred. And he said, he noted that the people were a little bit more hesitant to disclose their clans, even though the first time he came, they all wanted to talk about it. They were very, eager to share what clan they were and what the Indian names were and all that kind of stuff. But he said later on, he goes, they were a little bit more reluctant in the 1870s to divulge that kind of information. And who knows why. And so to pick up from there, the 1870s is when some major changes occurred. The Canadian government decided to bring in elections to the more civilized of Indian bands in Canada. And they called this the Indian Advancement Act. And it's kind of one of a series of legislative acts that we kind of lump together as the Indian Act. And so this was devised so that the communities that were in closer contact with settlers, mainly Ganawage, Akwesasne, Ganasatake, Six Nations, Tainanega, all those communities were considered more advanced. We had a longer history of contact. Those communities got special legislation. So we're bringing in elections, and they brought them in gradually, not right away. So you would have when a life chief, which is our usual standard kind of leader, when he would die, the Indian agent would say, well, let's have an election for this one chief. And so the people grumbled and didn't like it very much, but they kind of went along with it. So you would have one or two elected chiefs sitting on the same council with a bunch of traditionally chosen chiefs, the life chiefs. So that was gradually happening, but eventually the Canadian government decided, no, we need to have full elections, the whole council. So anyway, to carry on with the changes that are being brought from outside. Now, what happens when you try to legislate a change with Native people is it usually has the opposite effect. If you want them to accept elections and you come in forcing elections on them, all it's going to do is make them go back to their old ways and say, no, we need to beef those up. And that's exactly what happened. The communities began to have more meetings about their traditional systems. And it happened in all of the communities that were under the gun by the Canadian government. They all began to send people to each other, to the other communities, to meet with them, to strategize, to write petitions. And you see a flurry of petitions heading to Ottawa by all the people in the communities that were against these elections. I should also note that there were people in these communities who were in favor of elections. So it was not unanimous that people were opposed to them. There were always a small minority that wanted elections. Some of these people felt like the chiefs, the little clique of chiefs, didn't represent them, that dismissed them or whatever, for whatever reason. In Akwesasne, it was people that lived on Cornwall Island that had farms and had actually been Methodists that felt that the chiefs didn't really pay much attention to them. So they actually felt, well, with the Indian Act coming in, let's have an election. We want elected chiefs. So there was a little bit of support for these new measures that were coming in. So that's something that gets left out of a lot of the discussion. People like to convey that it was unanimous, people were opposed, but there was always a little faction, especially in Akwesasne, that wanted the elections, that wanted to have representation. So that's something to keep in mind. And those days, the late 19th century, were a pretty rough time. And what I mean by that is we are surrounded by new settlements, new towns. A lot more immigrants are showing up and setting up shops, and they don't always treat our people very good when they're in town. In the late part of the century, there were a lot of incidents of people getting shot when going to the neighboring towns, that there'd be an argument or a commotion in a store or something. And next thing you know, there's a shooting incident. So this was kind of a frequent thing. And another thing that was not doing anybody any good was the bootlegging of alcohol in the communities. You see a lot of newspaper accounts about misadventure because of alcohol and our people that would overdo it. And so you see a lot of that. And then later on in the 20th century, you would see, you know, bootlegging and stuff like that. So well, we're still talking about the late 19th century. And also, when I mentioned that outside influence ends up causing a revival of the political systems, that happened not only in Canada, but also in the United States. There was also legislation being passed in New York State called the Indian Law, and that was also bringing in elections in Haudenosaunee communities that didn't want it. And so there was reaction against that. And so people began to communicate more frequently and having more and more councils amongst each other. And it was around this time that the Onondagas of New York State and also the Senecas, who were still living in their ancestral territories, decided that they wanted to go to court for a claim. And they were worried that when they got to court, the court might say, well, you don't have all the Confederacy here. Who do you think you are, trying to argue Confederacy treaties when there's only so many of you? So they decided, well, let's kind of replenish the Confederacy. And they said, you know, there's some Mohawks living up in Akwesasne. The border goes through their community, so some of it's in the United States. Let's go up there and see if they're interested in having chiefs. And those will serve as the so-called American Mohawk Nation chiefs to participate in Confederacy affairs. And our people had been going to these Confederacy meetings up till then anyway, and had even asked for this kind of thing. So they decided, now's the time, let's do it. So they came up, they chose 9 individuals who lived on the US side of the reserve, and they had a great big ceremony where they designated them Mohawk Nation chiefs. And I know all about this because there's quite a bit of ink about it. There's a lot of articles. It was also in the census. And one of them was Philip Tarbell, Dola Gete, who was my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side. And there's pictures of him and everything. And he had one of those great big, huge walrus-type mustaches and was a very serious-looking guy. And he was a Wolf Clan chief. So that was the origin of the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs at Akwesasne. It hadn't existed before then. A lot of people wish it did, but it didn't. It was it's actually the last government to show its face in Akwesasne. And so they coexisted with the Life Chiefs, who were primarily on the Canadian side. But we can't really be sure about that because the membership in the Canadian Life Chief Council seems to fluctuate. There were a lot of lists of chiefs that were produced in this time period, and there's different names on them. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint where they all lived at the time. But those American Mohawk Nation chiefs, they can all be found on the census map of 1890. So that's where that stands. So you have a revival of the Iroquois Confederacy to a certain extent, and the Seven Nations of Canada, that old alliance of Catholic missions on the St. Lawrence, all of it because Canada comes in and says, hey, where can I put this election box here, this ballot box? Well, that's what happens. So you end up causing a big cultural revival that's going on even today. So that should be a lesson to people. Just leave us be. You know, if you want us to change something, just leave us alone. We'll change eventually. But when you come in with your guns and forcing everything, it's not going to work. And the prime example of this is when there was an election called in the village of St. Regis, a big mob of people showed up and refused to allow it to happen. And then another election was called, same thing happened. The same group of people not only boarded up the election place, where the schoolhouse where it was to be held, but kicked the police out because the police were called to monitor it. So the government considered that to be a riot, and they decided to punish the chiefs. And on May 1st, 1899, They came to arrest the chiefs early in the morning on a tugboat, and they came in plain clothes and went to the Indian agent's house early in the morning, and he sent a runner to go and gather the chiefs. So when they came walking down the road and into the Indian agent's house, they arrested them. Well, one of the chiefs managed to wrestle himself free and run out the door and yell, give a war cry, which was heard by other people, who told his older brother that there was trouble at the Indian agent's office. And so his brother went running through the door, fighting with the cops to free his brother, the chief, and the police shot him, and he fell dead on the floor. So they hustled the police hustled the chiefs away, got them on the tugboat, left the dead man laying on the Indian agent's office floor, and we memorialize that shooting to this day. It's a very dark day in our history, but it's commemorated. And that man's name was Akwesasne, also known as Jake Ice, and his brother was known as Jake Fire, because we're funny like that. We have names like that. Anyway, so that's the story of how elections came into Akwesasne, and the chiefs were arrested and had to agree to not oppose the elections, and eventually they were released from custody. And the elections were not popular for a long time, and it took a long time for the community in general to decide to actively participate in it. So that's the origin of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne today. They're on the Canadian side of the reserve, and they're the result of that imposition of elections. It's modified since then, of course, but like I said, all of the governments in Akwesasne have a past that is in conflict. So it has a lot to do with the border, with the outside forces, and the desire to change how we do things. So it makes it a very contentious study. So that brings us up to the end of the 19th century, 1899, and then we're talking about the 20th century later on. But that's where I thought I would wrap it up for tonight, is talking about that century, because like I said, it's quite a momentous time and a lot happens. So I think we have enough time to take on a few questions if Mr. Kelly would like to jump back in.
Thank you, Darren. That's awesome. We do have one question actually right off the bat here. So while other folks are thinking up, someone was wondering, Darren, if you could describe some of the items that you're wearing.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the shirt, first of all, is like the colonial men's shirt, the trade shirt, as we call it. Just a fairly standard work shirt that anybody would have worn. In the colonies. They were very popular with trade. And also another item that we love to get in trade were things made of silver, gorgets and medallions and crucifixes of various kinds. We would wear them, armbands, silver armbands, wristbands, earrings, and little nose bobs and all kinds of things. So we were really big on ornamentation. And so when we met Europeans with all this kind of trade goods, that was one of the things that drew us into the trade so extensively, was to get these kind of things, these shiny things. In addition to, the tomahawks made of metal and with, the muskets, the, gunpowder, all those wonderful things. That was a part of the trade. And another thing that we were really popular, that we loved, was finger weaving, sashes and things like that. You see this one is made of wool and finger woven, and it's got beads woven into it. That was real popular all over the place. Some of the other things you might see in people in the old days was porcupine quill work, embroidery. And that was even more popular than beadwork. In the old days, everybody was using porcupine quills, dyeing them, braiding them, and sewing them onto little wooden plates and things, it's pretty crazy what they would accomplish with porcupine quills. And so that's an art that's being revived today. So here's a pouch also with porcupine quill embroidery on there too. And, you know, there's just so many wonderful things that our people adopted from the colonists that we liked and didn't have a problem with. There were some things we didn't accept. Like, for instance, it was a long time before our people liked shoes, boots, did not like those. And another thing was breeches, the pants that the colonists wore. Our people did not like those, and we wore leggings that only went up about a few inches above the knee. And so we, around our middles, we would wear a long strip of wool about a foot wide and about 5 feet long that was called a breechcloth. And that's basically our air conditioning system during the summer when we're running around in the woods. So there were certain things we liked, the shirts, the hats, some of the vests, the blankets, the materials, and we accepted those from the trade, but there were other things that we weren't quite really in love with. But in the 19th century, by the time of the American Civil War, our people were wearing colonial, the same clothes as anybody else. And there are some amazing portraits of the guys who went and fought in the Civil War who are wearing regular clothes as anybody else, nice haircuts, and they look like they are modern people dressed up for a movie role or something. So that was a time of incredible change for people to adopt a new style of clothing, and also the way they fought in the war, instead of, you know, fighting as war parties, hunting and skulking around in the woods. No, they're regular soldiers. And one of my other ancestors, a man named Darren Bonaparte, who fought in the American Civil War, he was actually a prisoner of war of the South, and was finally released, and he had a lot of health ailments because of that, because he was a prisoner of war. So you know, that's a different kind of scenario for our people from the wars of the past, where they were just separate war parties called in to fight and attack and do crazy stuff. But as time went by, we're pretty much regular soldiers. And then ever after, we were soldiers of all kinds. For instance, we even had an American fighter pilot in World War II, in addition to a whole bunch of code talkers. We had Marines and Navy men, all kinds of, every different kind of soldier. At least 333 men from Akwesasne fought in World War II. And also we had guys in World War I, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, Desert Storm, you name it. Our people have always been really proud of serving in the armed forces of the United States. So that's another of our traditions. Wow, what an answer.
We got some really great questions. What's that?
What are you wearing? And he goes on about wars.
We got some really great questions coming in. I hope folks can hang around a few minutes. Darren, this is, I find this is kind of a typical in a good way, but a typical question I think we get a lot. How much interaction happens today between the American and Canadian Akwesasne territories? And is the border closed now between these two halves of the Mohawk land?
Oh, absolutely not. There's no real border in Akwesasne. The only border is when you travel from the edge of the res towards Messina, going to Cornwall and crossing through the port of entry. The rest of the reserve doesn't have any border crossing checkpoints, so people come and go, and we're the only people that are actually allowed to go back and forth across the US-Canada border during the COVID shutdown. No, very few other people, maybe businesses, doctors and people like that, they can come and go, but people from Akwesasne, you just got to show your ID card, and it's just a normal day for us here. So it's because of the border. They impose that on us, so they better make accommodations. So
Right. Okay. Boy, this is tough. Got some great questions. I'm going to kind of pick through them. Darren, when were members of your community, given that we have a big election coming up, when were members of your community given the right to vote in the U.S. and Canadian elections, and were women and men given it at the same time?
Oh my God. I don't know. I accidentally hit myself with this war club, and I lost all memory of that one. Yeah, that's kind of tough for 8 o'clock at night. I don't know. Well, it's different for each part of the reserve, the Canadian side and the American side, I guess. Are you talking about voting in outside elections?
I think so, Darren. I think they mean, U.S. Government elections and Canadian prime minister elections, that sort of.
That I knew it at one time. I just don't remember exactly when that is. So sorry about that. Good question.
That'll be some good homework for those folks.
Yeah.
Darren, let's see. Joe writes, Huff refers to observing ball playing when he was at Akwesasne. What type of game was it?
Oh, that was lacrosse, because he has a picture of the lacrosse stick in the text. And lacrosse, now immediately you're thinking college lacrosse, a bunch of guys in uniform and equipment and long sticks and all that, plastic sticks. This was the old style lacrosse where there'd be a lot more than a dozen people out on the field. There would be 20, 30, 40 people out there. And they're pretty much just stripped down to moccasins and breechcloths and playing with the bigger, long wooden stick. And it was curved. It wasn't the kind of like square-edged stick that you might see in antique shops now. But the stick was more rounded. It kind of looked like a bishop's staff, they said. So it had that curve, but they were long, and the game was played differently. It was more of a game of keep away. It wasn't so much all the fancy passing and scoring. In fact, there was no net. It was just a post on one end of the field and another one on the other end of the field. And what you did was you got the ball and you kept it in your net, in your lacrosse stick, and you just booked it to the other end and tried to hit the post with the ball. Not like from a distance, but right up to it, whack it. And so that's how it was played. And you're being constantly whacked by the other team. They're hitting you, they're slamming you, they're checking you. And you could come out of there with a broken arm, a broken shoulder or leg. It was pretty rough. People died. So, and it could go on for hours and hours and hours. And they're actually reviving that in the last 5 or 6 years. There's been revivals of that way of playing. And it's completely different from box lacrosse and field lacrosse that you know today. So there was an old wooden lacrosse stick festival in Akwesasne a few years ago where they did that. They had a craftsman make a whole bunch of those sticks. All the kids got to try it out, and it was a really awesome experience to see that played. So you might hear more about that in times to come.
Okay, Darren, I think we'll end with one more question, and boy, this could be a really tough one for 8 o'clock at night.
Wow.
The time period was an active one for new religious traditions, both native and non-native. Is there any evidence of interactions between them, i.e. Handsome Lake and the Shakers and the St. Regis Mohawk?
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Well, you mentioned Handsome Lake, and it's not the Shakers, but the Quakers who were missionaries to the Senecas that encountered Handsome Lake. Handsome Lake was a Seneca chief that was really in a dark time. This happened in 1799, and he had a vision. He got really sick and kind of went into a coma and had a vision of being visited by celestial beings who looked like native people but were clearly not. And they were from the heavens, who came to him to tell him to stop drinking and to urge his fellow people to stop drinking also. So that ended up reviving Seneca traditions. And he kind of became a political force after that. And he was the half brother of Corn Planter, who was a chief of some renown, but had kind of like faded away in importance by that time. So him having all these visions kind of amped up him and Corn Planter. And so they kind of regained a lot of their political clout. And so some say that his visions are a mix of Christian teachings from the Quakers and Haudenosaunee culture. So they say it's like a fusion. And others say, oh, no, this is a strictly legitimate indigenous vision. I don't want to weigh in on that because it's very contentious. A lot of people have some pretty profound disagreement about that. But he never made it to Akwesasne. He got as far as Onondaga, and then he died, and they buried him at the longhouse there. So he never made it to Akwesasne, but we already had kind of our own spiritual prophet a century before, in the 17th century, Saint Gadeli de Gakwita. And if you don't mind, I'll mention, I wrote a book about Saint Gadeli de Gakwita called A Lily Among Thorns. And I just love plugging my stuff, you know. This is the time to do it, I guess. So come to Akwesasne and buy that book too. And so, yeah, so she was a woman who lived in the Mohawk Valley and moved to Ganawage up in Canada. And she was also a very spiritual person who is now a saint, an actual verifiable Roman Catholic saint. So this thing of people becoming very regular, everyday people suddenly having visions or, you know, a special status is very common. And it happened all over Native America. There was a prophet, Tecumseh, the war leader, who also had a brother who was a prophet. And Pontiac also had a prophet with him named Neolin. So this was a common thing. At times of stress, you have people that suddenly have visions and they suddenly know what to do for their people. And whether they really had visions or not is, you know, remains to be seen. But yeah, that was very common. It's just that Handsome Lake never made it to Akwesasne and probably wouldn't have tried because at that time, the people were so heavily Roman Catholic at that time that they probably wouldn't have listened too much to what he was teaching. But like I said, he passed away around 1815, and that was pretty much it for him. But the movement that he started continues on. And I would say 3/4 of all Longhouse people kind of agree with his code, and maybe 1/4 of the Longhouse people, but who knows about the numbers on that. Anyway, so that's all I can offer you about that, about Handsome Lake and the missionary efforts that, you know, he's famous for.
Okay, Darren, thank you. I just want to say the compliments have been rolling in on the chat line. You probably don't get to see that, but folks have really appreciated. We want to express our gratitude for you taking the time out of your busy evenings here to share with us. I'm hoping that we can maybe have you back in the spring. We plan on continuing to do this through the spring. So I want to thank you, and I think I'll probably turn it back over to Selena. Did you have one more thing you wanted to add, Darren?
No, you're asking me, right?
Yeah, I didn't know. I saw you grab that. I didn't know if you wanted to say one more.
I was going to just, you know, have a puff of tobacco and fall asleep. No, I just want to thank you, Bruce, for reaching out. It's been a long time since I've seen you, since old Salmon River days. And my best to you and your family, and to everybody in the North Country that's tuned in tonight to listen to me yammer on about history. It's been my pleasure to do that. And hopefully when things open back up, I can go back out on the trail and do storytelling and wampum presentations with a full rack of wampum belts like I love to do. It's just that because of this Donald Trump thing, I kind of stay home. So.
Yeah, listen, you'll be welcome with open arms at North Country, I can tell you. So
yeah, just keep our distance.
Well, Well, thank you, Darren, and thank you, Bruce. Another wonderful, wonderful presentation at North Country Live tonight. We want to just send out a special thanks to our sponsor again, North Franklin Federal Credit Union, to our very own foundation, also to the marketing and enrollment folks at the college, and of course, what's near and dear to my heart is our Opportunities Committee that helps to form and bring these presentations. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and we hope that you will join us again, and tell your friends and family. North Country Live. Have a great evening.